I'm Alex Kielar, and this is Killer Kiels, the Horror King, a podcast where I blend my passion for horror with deep dive film history. Each episode ranks and analyzes classic supernatural films, exploring their impact, their craft, and why they resonate. It's part research, part personal journey, and all horror. Join me as we revisit the movies that built the genre, starting with episode 1, The Birth of Horror. Welcome to Killer Keels, the Horror King, your backstage pass to the shadows of cinema. I'm your host, Alex Kielar, and this is Chapter 1 of the Horror Chronicles, where we dig deep into the roots of horror and trace its evolution from flickering illusions to full-blown nightmares. Tonight, we're going back, way back, to the very first horror films ever made. No jump scares, no blood, just bats, devils, and the magic of early cinema. It all begins in 1896 with La Manor de Diable, or in English, The House of the Devil, directed by George Méliès. Released on Christmas Eve in Paris, this 3-minute silent film wasn't meant to terrify, it was meant to amuse. But it gave us the blueprint: supernatural beings, transformations, and a devil conjuring ghosts and witches inside a haunted hat castle. The plot? A bat flies into a castle and transforms into Mephistopheles, or as we know him as the devil. He conjures skeletons, ghosts, witches. Classic horror imagery before horror was really even a genre. One brave character tries to fight back, but the supernatural overwhelms him. In the end, the devil vanishes, and the survivors are left trembling. Méliès did not just direct this movie, just like a lot of these early silent films that he directed, he also starred in it. He didn't just act or direct, he also invented the visual tricks that defined early horror. Substitution splices, double exposure, stop motion. This wasn't just a movie, it was a magic show on film. So, as we go along these movies, I will be ranking them as I go along, and then once we get to multiple eras, I will be ranking them by era and overall. But for right now, this first official horror film in history, La Manor du Diable sits alone at number 1, and it earns that spot with ease. What Méliès does here isn't just clever for 1896, it's foundational. You can feel him discovering the language of horror as he goes. The bat transforming into the devil, the skeleton assembling itself, the witches appearing in smoke. These aren't just gags, they're the first building blocks of supernatural cinema. What really stands out is how confident the film feels. Méliès isn't experimenting timidly. He's throwing everything he can think of at the screen. And because he's a stage magician, he understands spectacle. Even though the tone is playful and it's not very scary, the imagery sticks with you, and these are elements that we see in horror films in the future. It's whimsical, but it's also eerie in a way that feels timeless. So for now, La Manor de Diable isn't just number 1 because it's the first. It's number 1 because it still works. It's imaginative, ambitious, and it sets a bar that every film after this will have to measure up to. So next up, we have the second film. Before Méliès summoned devils, he gave us a man, a bed, and a giant bug. A Terrible Night is a 1 minute silent comedy where Miles plays a man trying to sleep in a bed only to be attacked by a comically oversized insect. He fights it with a broom and ultimately traps it in a chamber pot before collapsing back into bed. It's slapstick, it's weird, and it's the earliest examples of narrative filmmaking, the setup, the conflict, and the resolution, all in under 60 seconds. There's also a survival mystery. The version most people know might actually be a later Miles film called A Midnight Episode. Miles's great great granddaughter believes the original survives only in a flipbook and a photo collage. So, with the Terrible Night, we now have our second entry, and we will be sliding that right into the number 2 spot. It's just not, it doesn't reach the level of the first film. It's a fun little film. It shows Méliès experimenting with different narratives, but it doesn't have the same ambition or visual punch as Le Manoir de Diable. It does have personality. It has pure slapstick energy, with the oversized bug, the frantic broom swimming, the chamber pot finale before he goes back into bed. But it's just not horror in the common sense. Maybe in a human sense, when we're trying to sleep and we get, even have nightmares of bugs crawling in our bed or in our room as you sleep. That's a very human kind of horror, and it plays up to with laughs. Of course, Méliès is trying to make it more of a comedy. It's obviously just early experimentation of these silent films. So for now, A Terrible Night takes the number 2 spot, and it's a fun detour, but the devil still reigns supreme. Of Le Manoir de Diable as number 1, and here with A Terrible Night number 2, both released in that same year of 1896. And our next stop in 1896 is The Vanishing Lady, one of the earliest filmed magic tricks, and the first major demonstration of the substitution splice. Méliès returns as he performs a stage illusion where a woman sits in a chair and he covers her with a cloth before she instantly, a second later, transforms into a skeleton. Then, with another flourish, she reappears unharmed. It's very simple. It's a very simple illusion. It's a very simple trick, but it's revolutionary. This is the moment Miles realizes the camera can do things the stage never could. The skeleton gag is quick, but it's effective, and it introduces a visual language that horror would use for decades. Transformation, disappearance, the uncanny shift from life to death. Skeletons are something that we see very often in the future of horror films. There's no devil here, there's no ghosts, no witches, but the skeleton alone is enough to place this film firmly in the lineage of early horror. And unlike A Terrible Night, which relies on props and performance, The Vanishing Lady is pure cinematic trickery. This is Méliès discovering the power of editing, and horror discovering the power of the impossible. So now that we've seen The Vanishing Lady, it's time to update our rankings. And I would put this one firmly in second place, above A Terrible Night. It earns this position because Méliès truly begins to understand what makes cinema different from just regular theater. The substitution splice he uses here is more than just a trick. It's a breakthrough. So compared to A Terrible Night, it's a fun, grounded film. It's a fun film grounded in physical comedy. The Vanishing Lady is a step forward. The skeleton reel is quick, and it's iconic. So for now, The Vanishing Lady claims the number 2 spot. So our updated rankings for now is Le Manoir de Diable at 1, The Vanishing Lady at 2, and A Terrible Night at 3. Next up, we move now into 1897 with The Bewitched Inn, another Méliès flick. A film that again uses the substitution splice and introduces a theme Méliès would return to again and again. objects tormenting their owners. A weary traveler checks into an inn, but nothing in the inn behaves. His clothes vanish. His suitcase opens by itself, and his bed refuses to cooperate by disappearing. Ghosts appear and disappear. Furniture moves on its own. It's playful, chaotic, and full of early stop motion magic. This film marks a shift from simple illusions to more complex sequences of supernatural mischief. And again, just like a lot of these early films, it's not very scary. It uses a lot of comedic aspects, but it's also mischievous in a way that feels like the ancestor of haunted house comedies. And unlike The Vanishing Lady, which is built around one big trick, The Bewitched Inn is a cascade of smaller illusions. And that is a showcase of Méliès's growing confidence as a filmmaker as he discovers more and more things he can do. So, now let's get into our rankings. With this film, since there's many more aspects that he uses, many more things, creative things that are going on here, a lot of objects being tormented with, and this just a lot of different things that we see going on here. As you see him taking off his pants, putting on the bed, and they just go up in the air. The ghost appears and rips it away, and he tries to go to sleep, go on the bed, but it disappears. But this film, I would say, is better than I think it's better than The Vanishing Lady at this point. The Vanishing Lady was just very much a shorter, a shorter film, and not many aspects going on. This one has so many different aspects going on. I'm gonna place this at number 2 in our rankings. So I believe that fits right there at number 2, right behind the Les Meneurs de Diable. So then we have The Bewitched Inn number 2, The Vanishing Lady number 3, and A Terrible Night at number 4. Our next film is again in 1897, titled The Hallucinated Alchemist, a short film from that year that was long believed lost, but a surviving print exists and has been restored. It's a fascinating piece of early cinema. It leans heavily into surreal imagery, giving us a glimpse of Méliès experimenting with psychological and symbolic horror decades before surrealism had a name. The film opens with an alchemist in his cluttered laboratory, surrounded by bottles, tools, and occult symbols. Suddenly, a star shaped apparition with 5 female heads materializes above him, spinning and shimmering in the air. A giant face appears next, looming over the alchemist with exaggerated expressions. Objects transform, vanish, and reappear as the alchemist reacts in frantic confusion. Unlike Méliès' more playful trick films, this one feels more dreamlike and a lot of more different elements that are related to more like science or like, an alchemist using potions, something like that going on. A lot of potion type of magic, like a wizard almost. And it almost feels nightmarish. There's no clear narrative, no clear direction, no real comedic payoff. It's just a lot of different things jumbled together going on, and it's basically this. I mean, the alchemist you can see here. It looks like he's falling asleep, but this is basically his dream. He's hallucinating. That's why it's called the alchemist's hallucination. It's basically him having all these hallucinations of stuff going on in his shop there. Um, it's a sequence, of hallucinations that are overwhelming him, pushing him toward panic. It's early psychological horror built on imagery rather than really following a story. As you see here, he really just gives up at the end and just falls to the ground. This is Maya stepping into stranger, more abstract territory, and it really just stands out because of that. Because it's a lot more, with a lot of later later horror films do go into that more psychological horror rather than strictly horror in the sense that we honestly we think about a lot of just horror, the scary things, not nothing with the mind, but that's happens a lot more. So now that we've seen the hallucinated alchemist, we can rank this. I think it's definitely good. It's better than some of these earlier films, but it's also a lot. Just a lot. There's a lot of things jumbled in here. It doesn't have a clear direction. I would probably put this below The Bewitched Inn, but I think it has, since it has so many of these different aspects, and it dives into the psychological horror. I'm gonna put it above The Vanishing Lady, so I'm gonna put it right at number 3. So we got Le Manoir de Diable at 1, The Bewitched Inn at 2, and then the Hallucinated Alchemist at 3, The Vanishing Lady at 4, and A Terrible Night at 5. And that was the top 5 for now. Those are the first 5 horror films, and that's how it's going to be for now. And let's just keep moving forward.
Next up, we have The X-Rays, another 1897 film. This one, a quick 1-minute British trick from another George. This one is George Albert Smith, the first early horror film not by George Méliès. This is one of the earliest examples of body distortion horror on screen. The setup is very simple. A courting couple steps in front of an X-ray machine, and with a single jump cut, they instantly transform into dancing skeletons. Another cut at the end restores them to normal, and the film ends almost as abruptly as it begins. It's a very playful aspect. It taps into something very real, however. X-rays were brand new in this era in the 1890s, and people were generally unsettled by the idea of seeing inside the human body. Smith takes that cultural anxiety and turns it into a visual gag, but the uncanny effect of watching people reduced to bones is unmistakably horror adjacent, with those comedic aspects as we see in George Méliès films as well. So for me, this film, The X-Rays, it lands at number 6. That feels right based on what I'm looking for in these early horror films. I appreciate the cleverness of the skeleton transformation. It's clean, it's quick, and it taps into a real cultural fear of the time. But when I compare it to the films already on my list, it just doesn't hit me as strongly. So that puts it right at number 6, with Le Manoir de Diable at 1, The Bewitched Inn at 2, The Hallucinated Alchemist at 3, The Vanishing Lady at 4, A Terrible Night at 5, and this film, The X-Rays, at number 6. Next up, we are back with Méliès for The Haunted Castle from 1897 in its English translation, which is often confused with the first film in 1896. Often has the same English title, although it also has translations as The Devil's House. It also is known as The Haunted Castle in some translations. This version is shorter, but has a lot of the same aspects that we saw in the original film. Seems like Méliès is just toying with some of the different things. He's focusing on pure transformation tricks. We see a man entering a room. Immediately the space turns against him. Objects appear and disappear. The chair moves on its own. A ghostly figure materializes only to dissolve again. What stands out here, the illusions are cleaner, the pacing is snappy, the film feels like a bridge between the chaotic energy of the Bewitched Inn and the more atmospheric supernatural pieces we'll see from Méliès in the coming years. It's not as elaborate as his later work will be, as we'll see, but it shows him getting more confident with staging, timing, and the rhythm of haunting. And this is more of shaping what a haunted room looks like on film. So, in my rankings, I'm going to be placing this right at number 6, just above The X-Rays. And the reason I give it that ranking is because even though it's short, it's only 39 seconds long, it has that unmistakable Méliès personality. The tricks are sharper as he gets more comfortable with using some of these tricks. And it has that unmistakable Méliès personality. It has more atmosphere than the British body horror gag we just saw. It just doesn't break into the top 5 because the Le Manoir de Diable, it just is more iconic. Obviously, it's the first official horror film, and some of these other ones, like The Bewitched Inn and The Hallucinated Alchemist, have more imaginative and more visual chaos. So, with that being said, our top 7 now is Le Manoir de Diable, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, A Terrible Night, The Haunted Castle, 1897, and then The X-Rays at 7. Next up, we have The Bewitched Hand from 1897. And before I even get into the description, I need to say this. This is a lost film, the first one we come across in this early days. No surviving print exists today. Everything we know about it comes from Méliès' Star Film catalog, exhibition notes, and early film journals. But even from those fragments, we get a surprisingly vivid picture. The film centers on a man whose hand becomes possessed and starts acting independently, slapping him, grabbing objects, and causing chaos. Méliès used substitution splices to animate the hand, creating the illusion that it had a mind of its own. What's striking is how modern the concept feels. This is 1897, and Méliès is already playing with the idea of a body part turning against its owner, a theme that will echo through horror for more than a century. Even though the film is lost, the idea itself is strong enough to earn its place in the early horror timeline. It's a reminder that the foundation of the genre is being laid not just through surviving films, but through works we can only reconstruct from history. So, where does The Bewitched Hand land for me? I'm putting it at number 6, right above the 1897 Haunted Castle. And honestly, the fact that it's a lost film doesn't hurt its placement, because what we do know about it is compelling. The idea of a possessed hand is such a strong horror concept, and it feels ahead of its time in a way that some of these early shorts don't. But it doesn't crack the top 5, because Le Manoir de Diable is still the genre's foundation. Bewitched Inn and The Hallucinated Alchemist are more visually imaginative, and The Vanishing Lady and A Terrible Night still feel more essential to the DNA of early horror. Still, The Bewitched Hand has a conceptual weight that I can't ignore. So, with the updated rankings, we now have Le Manoir de Diable, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, the lost film here, The Haunted Castle of 1897, and The X-Rays at 8. Now we go to 1898 with one of Méliès' most ambitious early works, titled The Astronomer's Dream, also known as The Man in the Moon. This is a 3-minute burst of surreal imagery and cosmic fantasy, and it marks a real turning point in how Méliès uses the supernatural. And he uses a lot of his same elements that he's used in some of these other films, and now making it longer with 3 minutes. And it feels like it's a combination of all these other films that he did, with using some of the same aspects. The film begins with the astronomer working in his observatory when Satan suddenly appears, as we saw Satan in the first ever film by Méliès in 1896. And the devil is only to be chased off by a fairy. The astronomer draws a globe on a chalkboard, and in classic Méliès fashion, the drawing springs to life, growing limbs and dancing across the board. Then he peers through his telescope, and the moon itself becomes a character, as you see here, looming large and swallowing him whole, swallowing other objects in the room whole. And then we see, inside the moon's mouth, the astronomer is tormented by celestial figures before being spit back into his observatory. The whole sequence plays like a fever dream. Like, I don't know, I think of someone being on drugs or something, having this dream, or just someone this with a big imagination, as astronomer might have. It's playful, chaotic, and tinged with something darker. There's a sense of cosmic unease, the idea of being dwarfed by forces beyond human comprehension. It's not horror in the modern sense, but it absolutely plants the seeds of cosmic horror and surreal fantasy that the genre will return to again and again in the future. While this film has so many of these different aspects, I am going to put The Astronomer's Dream at the number 2 spot. Honestly, it earns that spot because of how many aspects it has, how many different things are going on, how many, you see the objects disappearing as he tries to sit on chairs, the devil being in it, the angel, and other cosmic beings inside the moon, before he lands back into the observatory, waking up from this fever dream. What pushes it this high for me is how confidently it blends the fantasy aspects and the horror aspects. There's a cosmic unease to it, that feeling of being dwarfed by feelings you can't understand, and that's something horror won't fully embrace until decades later. the chalkboard globe coming to life, the demonic figure, the celestial torment inside the moon. It all feels like Méliès stretching the boundaries of what early cinema could even imagine. It doesn't quite dethrone Le Manoir du Diable, because that film still feels like the birth of horror and something we need to really put at top until something comes along to dethrone it. And that's the moment the genre sparks to life. But The Astronomer's Dream is the first time Méliès feels truly visionary. It's not just tricks anymore, it's world building, it's atmosphere, it's ambition. And that's why it takes the number 2 spot, with Le Manoir du Diable at 1, The Astronomer's Dream at 2, The Bewitched Inn at 3, The Hallucinated Alchemist at 4, The Vanishing Lady at 5, A Terrible Night at 6, The Bewitched Hand, a lost film at 7, The Haunted Castle of 1897 at 8, and The X-Rays at 9. Now we arrive at a major milestone in the history of the genre, The Cavalier's Dream from 1898, which is often regarded as the first official American horror film. This wasn't made by Méliès, and it wasn't directed by Edwin S. Porter, despite what some YouTube uploads claim, as Porter didn't start directing until 1901. This film comes from Vitagraph Studios, founded by J. Stuart Blackton and Albert E. Smith, and it was distributed by Edison. It's only about a minute long, but it's packed with a supernatural imagery. A cavalier falls asleep, a table materializes out of thin air, a woman appears on top of it, transforms into a witch, and then into Mephistopheles himself. The demon torments the sleeping man before vanishing, leaving the cavalier startled awake. What's striking is how clearly this film shows the influence of Méliès while still feeling distinctly American. The tricks are simpler, the staging is more grounded, and the tone leans more toward nightmare than whimsy. It's a direct attempt to bring the French supernatural trick film style to the United States, and in doing so, it becomes the birth of American horror cinema. So, I'm placing The Cavalier's Dream at number 6 in my rankings, and that feels exactly right for what this film represents. It's not as visually inventive as The Vanishing Lady, or as chaotic and supernatural as The Bewitched Inn, but it has something those films don't: historical weight. This is the first American horror film, the moment the United States enters the genre, and that alone gives it a presence that sticks with me more than something like A Terrible Night. The imagery is simple but effective. The dream structure, the witch transformation, the appearance of Mephistopheles. It's a clean, early example of nightmare logic on film, and it shows American filmmakers trying to catch up to Méliès while still putting their own stamp on the supernatural. It doesn't break into the top 5 because the films above it are either imaginative, more influential, or technically impressive. But The Cavalier's Dream is undeniably memorable, and its place in horror history pushes it above the lighter, more comedic shorts. That's why it lands at number 6. So, after 10 films now, our top 10 is Le Manoir du Diable at 1, The Astronomer's Dream at 2, The Bewitched Inn at 3, The Hallucinated Alchemist at 4, The Vanishing Lady at 5, The Cavalier's Dream at 6, A Terrible Night at 7, The Bewitched Hand at 8, The Haunted Castle at 9, and The X-Rays at 10. Next, in 1898, we return to Méliès with his The Four Troublesome Heads, as it is translated in English. One of his most iconic early trick films and a major leap forward in multi-exposure effects. The premise is simple but instantly memorable. Méliès plays a magician who removes his own head, places it on a table, and then repeats the process until 4 identical heads all singing, arguing, and reacting to each other. What makes this film stand out is how clean and confident the technique is for 1898. Méliès had already mastered substitution splashes, but this one is one of the first times he layers multiple exposures to create simultaneous duplicates of himself. The result is uncanny in a way that feels surprisingly modern. Each head has its own personality. One sings, one grimaces, one laughs, and the effect is both funny and unsettling. This is early horror comedy in its purest form. The humor doesn't cancel out the weirdness. It actually enhances it. But I'm putting The Four Troublesome Heads at number 7, and a big part of that is the way it blends comedy with the uncanny. This is Méliès having fun, but the humor actually makes the supernatural elements feel even stranger. That mix of comedy and discomfort is something early horror does really well, and Méliès is basically inventing that tone here. The trick works because it's playful, but the imagery sticks with you in a way that's just a little unsettling. It's not trying to scare you, but it's definitely poking at that part of your brain that goes, okay, this is funny, but also what am I looking at? It just doesn't break into the top tier for me because the films above it either have stronger supernatural concepts or more atmospheric world building. But as a piece of early horror comedy, and as a technical leap with those multi-exposure effects, it earns a solid spot in the middle of the list. So, the updated rankings after 11 films, we have Le Meneur de Diable, The Astronomer's Dream, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Four Troublesome Heads, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, and then The X-Rays. Next, in 1898, we have The Temptation of St. Anthony, and this one reaches into a kind of horror that feels more personal, more internal, and honestly more real than anything we've covered so far. Long before cinema, St. Anthony's story was one of the most powerful horror narratives in Christian tradition. A man alone in the desert, fighting not monsters of flesh, but the demons of temptation, doubt, and spiritual assault. The legend goes back to the 4th century writings of Athanasius, who describes Anthony withdrawing from the world to seek God, only to be met with visions meant to break him. These weren't just creatures, they were manifestations of fear, desire, and spiritual weakness. Artists like Schrödinger, Grunewald, and especially Hieronymus Bosch turned these visions into some of the most terrifying images in Western art, grotesque hybrids, seductive apparitions, and landscapes that feel like the inside of a spiritual nightmare. Méliès brings that entire tradition into a single minute of film. St. Anthony prays before a crucifix, and suddenly women appear, vanish, multiply, embodiments of a temptation surrounding him. Then the crucifix itself transforms into a woman, turning the symbol of Christ into a source of seduction and fear. Anthony collapses, overwhelmed not by physical danger, but by the terror of spiritual failure. What makes this film so powerful is that it taps into a kind of horror that doesn't rely on monsters or violence. It's the horror of being spiritually attacked, of feeling your faith shaken, of facing temptation that feels stronger than you are. For anyone who's ever wrestled with their own weaknesses, and especially for Christians who understand the weight of temptation, this film hits a deeper nerve than any trick effect or ghostly prank. It's one of the earliest cinematic expressions of religious horror, and it still resonates because the fear it depicts is universal and painfully human. So, with that all being said, I'm placing The Temptation of St. Anthony at number 2, and that's because this film taps into a kind of horror that feels more real to me than anything else in this era. The scariest horror isn't always the monsters or the jump scares. It's the eternal battles, the temptations, the moments where you feel spiritually vulnerable. As a Christian, that's the kind of fear that hits closest to home. And Méliès captures that in a way that's surprisingly powerful for a 1-minute film. It just doesn't take the top spot because I still see Le Meneur de Diable being the number 1 because of it being the birth of cinematic horror, and nothing can overtake it until I really feel powerful about the film. It was the spark that started everything. But in terms of emotional and spiritual weight, The Temptation of St. Anthony stands above almost everything else we've seen. It's one of the first films to explore horror not as a spectacle, but as a reflection of the battles we fight inside ourselves. And that's why it takes the number 2 spot. So, updated rankings after 12 films: Le Meneur de Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Four Troublesome Heads, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, and The X-Rays. Next, in 1898, we have The Magician, another Méliès film, and it feels like he's letting the supernatural run wild. Instead of the controlled theatrical illusions he's been perfecting, this short throws the magician into a whirlwind of transformations he can't quite keep up with. A woman becomes a skeleton, the skeleton becomes a woman again, objects appear and vanish without warning, and the magician is constantly reacting, scrambling, trying to regain control over forces that clearly have a mind of their own. What stands out here is the pace. Méliès usually lets his tricks breathe, but the magician moves fast, almost aggressively. There's a frantic energy to it, a sense that the magic is no longer performative, but something unruly and alive. And that skeleton transformation, even though it's brief, is one of the earliest moments where Méliès dips into something generally macabre. It's not horror in the spiritual or psychological sense, but it is a moment where the supernatural stops being playful and becomes something a little darker. And with that, I'm placing The Magician at number 8, and that feels right for what this film brings to the table. It's not as thematically heavy as the films above it, especially now that The Temptation of St. Anthony has taken the number 2 spot, but it is a step up from the lighter supernatural shorts. The energy here is sharper, the pacing is tighter, and that skeleton transformation gives it a quick flash of the macabre that sticks with me more than something like Four Troublesome Heads. What I like about this film is a sense of chaos, but it just doesn't climb higher because the films above it either have stronger supernatural concepts, more emotional resonance, or more historical weight. But as a piece of early supernatural cinema, fast, chaotic, and just a little bit eerie, The Magician earns its place at number 8. So with that being said, the updated rankings are Le Manoir de Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Magician, The Four Troublesome Heads, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, and The X-Rays. Next up, we have the famous Box Trick, the final quote-unquote horror film from 1898. And this comes from Méliès the Magician rather than Méliès the horror pioneer. The setup is straightforward. A performer steps into a box, the magician closes it, and suddenly a person inside disappears, reappears, or returns as someone completely different. It's a clean demonstration of the substitution splice, the editing trick that Méliès has been refining since The Vanishing Lady, and technically it's executed well. But in terms of horror, this one barely brushes the edge of the genre. There's a faint hint of uncanny transformation, the idea of stepping into a container and merging as someone else, but Méliès never leans into anything eerie or unsettling. The tone is light, playful, and firmly rooted in stage magic tradition. Compared to the films around it, especially the spiritual weight of The Temptation of St. Anthony or the chaotic spiritual energy of The Magician, this short feels small and ultimately forgettable. So, with that being said, I'm placing the famous Box Trick at number 14, right below the X-Rays, at the bottom of this list. It's clever, it's polished, and it shows Méliès getting more confident with his editing tricks, but as a horror film, it doesn't leave much of an impression. It leans heavily on magic and comedy, and none of it feels eerie or atmospheric in the way the stronger films do. There's no real sense of danger, no spiritual tension, no emotional weight. It's fun, but it's not memorable. So, with that being said, our updated rankings are Le Manoir de Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Magician, The Four Troublesome Heads, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, The X-Rays, and The Famous Box Trick. Now, we enter 1899 with The Miser's Doom. And even though the film itself is lost, its place in horror history is undeniable. This widely considered to be the first British horror film in history, and it already shows a very different approach to the supernatural than what Méliès was doing in France. The story, preserved through early film catalogs and written descriptions, is simple but powerful. A greedy miser is confronted by the ghost of a man he wronged. The spirit appears not to frighten for entertainment, but to force a moral reckoning. A supernatural judgment scene straight out of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And that's important because British horror begins not with monsters or spectacle, but with conscience. Where Méliès often treats the supernatural as playful or chaotic, The Miser's Doom leans into the fear of guilt. The fear of being seen for who you really are, and the fear of facing the consequences of your actions. It's horror rooted in morality, the idea that the supernatural arrives to correct, to punish, to reveal. Even without surviving footage, you can feel the emotional weight of that concept. And the fact that the film is lost is almost poetic. It exists as a ghost in the historical record, a story we know happened, but can't fully see. A haunting in its own right. And in a way, that makes it even more in line with its subject matter, a film about a ghost that has itself become a ghost. With all that being said, I'm placing The Miser's Doom right at number 10, and that feels like the right balance between its historical importance and the fact that the film itself is lost. As the first British horror film, it matters. It marks the moment when horror branches out beyond France and that one United States film and starts taking on a different emotional tone. British horror leans into moral fear, guilt, and supernatural judgment, and even in its absence, you can feel that DNA in the descriptions of this film. But without surviving footage, it can't climb higher than the films that actually exist in front of me. I can't see the ghosts, I can't feel the atmosphere, and I can't experience the miser's moment of reckoning, so it lands above the lighter, more comedic supernatural shorts because the concept is stronger and the thematic weight is real, but below the films that have tangible presence and emotional impact. So the updated rankings after 15 films is La Manière de Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Magician, The Four Troublesome Heads, The Miser's Doom, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, The X-Rays, and the famous Box Trick. Next up, in 1899, we have The Devil in a Covenant, which is one of the first films in early cinema that truly understands the emotional weight of religious horror. Méliès opens on a quiet covenant, a place defined by prayer, order, and spiritual refuge. It's the last place you expect chaos, and that's exactly why the film hits so hard when the devil appears. He doesn't creep in from the shadows. He doesn't haunt from a distance. He enters the covenant, boldly, physically, as if he has every right to be there. And that intrusion is the horror. It's the fear that evil can cut into a place of holiness, that the sanctuary isn't as sealed as we want it to be. From that moment, the film becomes a storm of demonic activity. The devil multiplies, transforms, and disrupts everything around him. Nuns flee in panic, as the sanctuary, the one place meant to be protected from evil, is torn open. The imagery is theatrical, but the emotional core is unmistakably real. Méliès is tapping into a fear that's been part of Christian storytelling for centuries. The fear that evil doesn't always stay outside. Sometimes it walks straight into the place where you're supposed to be safe. But what makes this film powerful isn't just the invasion, it's the banishment. After the chaos, a priest arrives, lifting a cross high above his head. The moment the cross enters the frame, the entire tone shifts. The devils recoil. The supernatural disorder collapses. Holiness pushes back, and in a burst of theatrical energy, the evil is driven out of the covenant entirely. The sanctuary is restored, peace returns, and good wins. And with all of that being said, I'm placing The Devil in a Covenant right at number 4 in the rankings. It earns that spot because of how real the horror feels, and how real the victory feels. There's something deeply frightening about the idea of the devil cutting into a place of holiness. That's a fear that hits on a spiritual level, especially for me as a Christian. Temptation is terrifying because it feels personal, invasive, and close. This film captures that feeling better than almost anything else from this era. But what elevates it is the ending. The evil doesn't just cause chaos, it gets banished. The cross enters, the devils flee, and holiness reclaims the space. That's powerful. That's the kind of spiritual resolution that resonates with me far more than the playful supernatural films. It doesn't reach the emotional depth of The Temptation of St. Anthony, which still sits at number 2 because of how powerful it betrays spiritual struggle. But The Devil in a Covenant comes incredibly close. It's bold, it's unsettling, and it ends with good triumphing over evil. That's why it sits at number 4. So the updated rankings are La Manière de Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Devil in a Covenant, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Magician, The Four Troublesome Heads, The Miser's Doom, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, The X-Rays, and the famous Box Trick. Next up, we have The Pillar of Fire, also from 1899. It's one of Méliès' shorts that hits you with a single striking image and then disappears almost as quickly as it arrives. We see here the devil landing and turning everything into fire, almost setting everything on fire in the frame. And then a woman appears, and with a burst of editing or magic, she erupts into a living column of flame. Her body becomes fire, twisting Flickering, almost dancing, before collapsing back into human form, she almost seems like a fallen angel, like the devil is. It's mesmerizing, but there's also an uneasiness underneath it. Fire is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. It consumes, it destroys, it purifies, and Méliès captures that duality in a way that feels surprisingly modern. The woman isn't just performing a trick, she's becoming something elemental, something that doesn't obey human rules. With that being said, though, I'm placing The Pillar of Fire at number 17. The imagery is strong, and women turning into a living flame is one of the most visually memorable moments of this era. But as a horror film, it doesn't carry the emotional or spiritual weight of the works above it. It's more of a striking moment than a meaningful story. There's a hint of danger in the transformation, but it never pushes into anything truly unsettling. Compared to the films that deal with temptation, spiritual invasion, or moral judgment, this one feels lighter, more like a spectacle than a confrontation with the supernatural. It still lands above the famous box trick because the imagery lingers and the elemental transformation has more thematic bite. But it doesn't rise above the films that actually explore fear, spirituality, or the uncanny in a deeper way. The updated rankings now after 17 films is Le Meneur Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Devil in a Covenant, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Magician, The Four Troublesome Heads, The Miser's Doom, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, The X-Rays, The Pillar of Fire, and the famous box trick. Next up, we have The Devil in the Tavern, another lost Méliès film, and it's one that often gets confused with The Devil in a Covenant, simply because the titles are similar and both feature Méliès' signature devil character, but they're completely different stories. Convent is a spiritual horror, evil invading a holy place. Tavern is something else entirely, the devil slipping into everyday life. The descriptions we have paint a vivid picture. Imagine a crowded tavern, noisy, messy, full of drinking and laughter, and into that space walks the devil, not as a symbol, not as a metaphor, but as a literal figure who begins tormenting the patrons with chaotic transformations, vanishings, and supernatural mischief. It's the darker cousin to the Bewitched Inn, where the supernatural disrupts ordinary people in an ordinary place. And even though the film is lost, you can still imagine what it must have looked like. Méliès would have filled the frame with sudden appearances, disappearances, objects flying, chairs moving, people reacting in shock as the devil bends reality around them. The tavern's setting gives it a different energy than the religious films, more chaotic, more comedic, but with a sharper edge, because the devil isn't just a prankster spirit, he is the devil himself. There's something unsettling about that. Evil entering a holy place is frightening in one way, that's Covenant. But evil entering a normal place, a human place, a place where people let their guard down, that's frightening in a different way. It's the idea that the supernatural doesn't just haunt the sacred, it can cut into the everyday. And I'm placing The Devil in the Tavern at number 5. That might seem high for a lost film, but the concept is just that strong. The idea of the devil invading an ordinary space, a tavern full of regular people, hits a nerve. It's similar to The Devil in a Covenant, in that evil intrudes where it doesn't belong, which is probably why the two films get confused. But the tone is completely different, and that difference matters. Even without footage, I can picture it. I can see the devil causing chaos, the patrons reacting in shock, the tavern turning into a stage for supernatural disruption. And that imagined version still feels more thematically rich than many of the surviving films. It's not as spiritually heavy as Covenant, but it taps into a fear that feels real, the fear that evil can show up anywhere, even in the places where life is loud and human and unguarded. Especially when you think about the temptation of drinking. When you go to a bar, that's where the devil can show up, for sure, because you can end up going too far. But now, with our updated rankings, after 18 films, we have Le Meneur du Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Devil in a Covenant, The Devil in the Tavern, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Magician, The Four Troublesome Heads, The Miser's Doom, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, The Pillar of Fire, The X-Rays, and the famous box trick. Next up, we have The Mysterious Night, one of Méliès' most technically clever early films, showing him leaning fully into the uncanny possibilities of cinematic illusion. A knight sits at a table, calmly sketching, and the moment he finishes drawing a head, that painted head suddenly appears beside him, smiling, nodding, and behaving as if it were alive. That's the key to this film. The head he draws, a painted likeness mounted on board, brought to life through multiple exposures and substitutes and splashes. Méliès isn't showing bodily harm or decapitation, he's showing the unsettling idea of an image becoming animate, a drawing stepping into the physical world. The effect is playful, but it brushes against something uncanny, seeing a painted head suddenly behave like a person and then multiply, vanish, and also turn into an actual body. Taps into very old fear, the fear of representations coming alive, of art refusing to stay still. It's not really horror in a spiritual sense, but it's a moment where the boundary between the real and the unreal gets thin enough to feel strange. So, with that being said, I am placing The Mysterious Night at number 6, right behind The Devil in the Tavern, even though this film isn't spiritually heavy or morally charged. It's one of Méliès' most effective early explorations of the uncanny. Watching a knight calmly interact with a painted head he's drawn, a head that suddenly behaves like a living thing and even attaches to what appears to be a real body, is strangely unsettling, even with that playful tone in mind. It doesn't have the thematic power of The Devil in a Covenant or the conceptual weight of The Devil in the Tavern, but it's still a stronger, more memorable piece than many of the lighter trick films. The imagery sticks with you, the technique is impressive, and the uncanny quality gives it just enough of a horror edge to lift it above the middle tier. So, number 6 feels just right. And with that being said, this is the updated rankings. We have Le Manoir de Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Devil in a Covenant, The Devil in the Tavern, The Mysterious Night, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Magician, The Four Troublesome Heads, which this also is very similar to, The Miser's Doom, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, The Pillar of Fire, The X-Rays, and the famous box trick. Before we move on, I want to take a quick detour to mention a couple of films that aren't horror at all, but are important to Méliès' journey as a filmmaker. Since they are not horror, we will not be ranking them alongside the other supernatural films of this episode. But since they are important, I want to definitely take a quick detour to mention them. The Cinderella of 1899 is the first, and this is Méliès' first big narrative production, a 6-minute-long feature silent film with multiple scenes, elaborate sets, full transformations. And you can feel him leveling up as a filmmaker. The magic here isn't meant to frighten, but the technique he perfects in Cinderella are the same ones he'll use to build more ambitious supernatural films later. Next up in Méliès' 1899 output is The Dreyfus Affair, which isn't horror at all either. It's actually one of the earliest examples of political cinema. Méliès recreates the real-life trial and imprisonment of Alfred Dreyfus, a French Jewish officer falsely accused of treason. What's wild is that Méliès shot this as a series of stage reenactments, almost like early documentary drama hybrids, and they were controversial even at the time. I'm not ranking this one or Cinderella because they both don't touch the supernatural or the uncanny, but it's worth mentioning because it shows Méliès stepping outside fantasy and experimenting with realism, narrative continuity, and multi-scene storytelling. And this one is 11 minutes long, longer than Cinderella. Those skills he shows here, including the ability to build a story across multiple tableaus, are the same ones he'll use later when he returns to supernatural themes. So this is another quick historical mile marker before we get back to the horror of it all. The Devil in the Studio is one of those Méliès films that only survives in catalog descriptions, and it's easy to get confused about it because there's a 1901 British film with the same English title. That one survives. The Méliès film, the one from 1899, is lost, and no footage is known to exist. But even without the film itself, the concept is powerful. Méliès plays an artist working in a studio when the devil appears and begins sabotaging the creative process. The devil interferes with the painting, disrupts the props, and turns the studio into a chaotic, unpredictable space. And because Méliès himself plays both the artist and the devil, the whole thing feels strangely personal, like he's staging the internal battle every creative person knows. What resonates with me is that this isn't a devil haunting a castle or a convent or a tavern. It's a devil haunting the studio, the place where ideas are supposed to take shape, the place where you're vulnerable, the place where you're trying to make something out of nothing. And the fact that this film is lost adds another layer to it, a piece of creative expression swallowed by time, a reminder of how fragile the artistic process can be. It's almost poetic. A film about creative chaos that didn't survive the chaos of history. Even imagined, it carries more emotional weight than many of the surviving trick films. That's why, in the new rankings, I am placing The Devil in the Studio from 1899 right at number 5, above The Devil in the Tavern, and the reason is personal. The idea of the devil invading the creative space, the studio, the place where imagination is supposed to be safe, hits me harder than the devil disrupting a tavern. I relate to that chaos. I know what it feels like when the creative process gets derailed, when something unpredictable slips into the work. And the fact that this film, again, is lost makes it even more meaningful. It's a piece of art that didn't survive, a reminder of how delicate creation can be. I can only imagine what it looked like, but that imagined version feels richer and more emotionally resonant than some of the films we still have. So number 5 just feels right. And with the updated rankings, we have Le Manoir du Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Devil in a Covenant, The Devil in the Studio, The Devil in the Tavern, The Mysterious Night, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Magician, The Four Troublesome Heads, The Miser's Doom, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, The Pillar of Fire, The X-Rays, and The Famous Box Trick. The Mysterious Portrait is a perfect way to close out Méliès' supernatural work of the 1890s, because it's a film about images coming to life, which is exactly what cinema itself was becoming at the time. The setup is simple. A man sits beside a framed portrait, and through a series of dissolves and substitutions, the portrait begins to animate. The painted figure becomes a living person, stepping out of the frame, interacting with the real world, and then slipping back into the image as if nothing happened. There's something quietly uncanny about it. The portrait isn't a ghost, and it isn't a devil. It's an image that refuses to stay still. Méliès is playing with the idea that art can cross its boundaries, that representation can become reality, and that the things we create can take on a life of their own. And because this is the final supernatural film of 1899, it almost feels symbolic. Méliès spent the late 1890s experimenting with devils, ghosts, skeletons, witches, and alchemists. All these chaotic forces invading the world, but here, at the end of the decade, the supernatural force isn't a creature, it's an image, a picture that becomes a person. So with that being said, I am placing The Mysterious Portrait at number 10. It's not as emotionally resonant as The Devil in the Studio, or as spiritually charged as The Temptation of St. Anthony, but it's a beautifully executed supernatural idea. The living portrait effect is clean, eerie, and surprisingly elegant. And as the final supernatural film of 1899, it feels like a quiet exhale. A moment where Méliès shifts from devils and ghosts to the magic of cinema itself. It's a fitting end to the decade and a fitting end to this arc. With all that being said, the final rankings for this 1896 to 1899 initial horror era, we have Le Manoir du Diable, The Temptation of St. Anthony, The Astronomer's Dream, The Devil in a Covenant, The Devil in the Studio, The Devil in the Tavern, The Mysterious Night, The Bewitched Inn, The Hallucinated Alchemist, The Mysterious Portrait, The Vanishing Lady, The Cavalier's Dream, The Magician, The Four Troublesome Heads, The Miser's Doom, A Terrible Night, The Bewitched Hand, The Haunted Castle, The Pillar of Fire, The X-Rays, and The Famous Box Trick. And that brings us to the end of 1899, and really the end of the first era of cinematic horror. From 1896 to 1899, Méliès built the foundation of supernatural cinema, with a few other directors making their mark in the early days of horror. Devils appear in puffs of smoke, ghosts materializing out of thin air, skeletons dancing, bodies splitting apart, and images coming to life as we saw in this last film. These films weren't just tricks. They were the first attempts to visualize the impossible, to give shape to fear, wonder, and the uncanny. And as the century turned, Méliès' work would only grow more ambitious. But these early films, these strange, flickering experiments, are where horror cinema begins. They're the first shadows on the wall. And the story does not end there, because as the calendar turns to 1900, Méliès does not slow down. The tricks get sharper, the illusions get stranger, the supernatural becomes more ambitious, and the films start to stretch beyond simple gags into something richer. Stories, characters, worlds, more things happening than just a single scene. Next episode, we step into a new century and a new phase of horror's evolution. The magic gets bigger, the shadows get deeper, and the genre starts to find its voice. The 1900s are where things really begin to take shape. So join me next time as we open the door to the next chapter and watch horror cinema grow up.